Okay, well, if hopefully you are refreshed from your lunch and are ready to go, we are ready to move into our next general session here with John Eidsmoe. It is Limiting Government, Federalism, and States' Rights. This is one I think I'm very interested in. Hopefully you are too. So why don't we welcome John Eidsmoe up for this session.
Good afternoon. Let me ask a question here. How many of you have ever heard of a man by the name of Sir Lancelot, but not Sir Lancelot of the Round Table, Sir Lancelot Andrews? Anybody ever heard of Sir Lancelot Andrews? He was a chief preacher in the court of King James I, and he was a chief editor and translator for the King James Bible, and he primarily responsible for translating Genesis all the way through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and also the book of Psalms. I'm going to give you a quotation from him that I think is priceless. It is not our task to preach what people wish to hear, but what someday, in some sad future, they will wish they had heard. That's a good saying for every preacher, but not necessarily something that's going to wake us up right after lunch. That's the hardest slot in preaching or teaching, they say. So maybe I should talk about a horror story instead. No, I'm not talking about the nightly news. Anybody here ever read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley? The book itself is quite a philosophical work, but of course it's been degenerated into one horror movie after another, each one cheapened further and further. But I'm going to tell you a story of the 12 Dr. Frankensteins. 12 Dr. Frankensteins got together in a laboratory. They were going to create a humanoid creature that would be their servant. And so they created this man, and they simply called him Frankenstein. I'm saying 12 because that's all the doctors there were. There was a 13th, Dr. Frankenstein, but he never showed up at the lab. And so they created this three-headed creature that they simply called Frankenstein. He was to be their servant, do the hard work for them, get things done that they were unable or uninclined to do for themselves. But as they fed Frankenstein, Frankenstein gradually grew bigger and bigger, and he became a monster, and he became their master. And it took a while before they realized it, and before he realized it. But one time, Frankenstein turned on the, by this time, 13 Dr. Frankensteins, and actually many more Frankenstein relatives joined after that. And he said, "I've been your servant, but now I'm your master. You're going to do what I say. You're going to take my orders. You're going to pay me whatever I demand that you pay me. And by the way, if you ever have any disputes with me about anything, it'll be resolved by my third head over here." Well, obviously, I'm giving you a parable about the Constitutional Convention, where 12 states, Rhode Island wasn't there, got together to form a federal government. A federal government that was to be their servant, but which grew and grew to become their master. This wasn't what the framers had intended to create. They didn't want it this way. And it happened gradually. Actually, they created this Frankenstein with some very severe limitations. One of those limitations was the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment, of course, simply says that the power is not delegated by this Constitution to the United States, meaning to the federal government, or prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The framers didn't even think the amendment to say that was necessary at first. They thought it was perfectly clear. They were creating a government that had only the powers they had delegated to it and no others. and any power that was not delegated to the federal government, they understood was reserved to the states or to the people. There was a case back in 1941, United States versus Darby, in which the question concerned the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce, in which they said the power to regulate interstate commerce includes commerce and production within a state if that affects interstate commerce. And they said in their opinion that our ruling is not affected by the 10th Amendment. They said the 10th Amendment states but a truism that all is retained that is not surrendered. It sounds like they're talking lightly about the 10th Amendment, but what they're saying is actually correct. When the framers adopted the 10th Amendment in 1789, ratified 1791, they thought they were simply stating what was already obvious. They just wanted to make sure that no knucklehead in the 21st century got it turned around. And as they went on to say, there was nothing that was constitutional for the federal government to do in 1790 that became unconstitutional when the 10th Amendment was adopted. But the point is, the 10th Amendment was the cornerstone. It stated the principle that was the cornerstone of what freedom is all about. Government, the federal government, has only the power that we, the people, have delegated to it. All others are reserved to the states or to the people. In the last hour, we were talking about limiting federal power and limiting it by dividing it, separating it horizontally into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. In this period, we're going to be talking about limiting federal power vertically by separating it between the federal and the state, and then further into the local levels of government. Why is it important to keep government local? Because as the more local government is, the more control individuals have over what government does. You can go to your school board and you can raise your concerns. They may or may not listen, and if they don't, you can launch a campaign to run somebody against them, but you at least have a chance to be heard before your school board or your library board or your city council or your county commissioners. At the state legislature, it's a little more difficult, but you can still sign up to be heard in legislative committees when they're considering legislation. Sometimes they'll let you talk, sometimes they won't, sometimes they'll limit you to a couple of minutes and so on. But at any rate, you have a fair amount of ability to influence what your local government does. Some ability to influence what your state government does, but much more difficult at the federal level. And if the local government abuses power, the state or the federal can come in and correct it. If the federal government abuses power, it's pretty hard for anybody to correct that. So the presumption should be that, first of all, private enterprise should be doing things if possible. But if government is needed, we start at the local level, then the state level, and only if none of these can do the job do we go to the federal level, and then only if the Constitution has authorized the federal government to act in that way. As a result, the federal government began in a very limited way. When George Washington took office in 1789, he began with an administration of 350 federal civilian employees, governing a nation of a little more than 3 million people. Obviously, it's grown a great deal to where today we have over 3 million federal civilian employees. And that's not including postal workers, because they're kind of semi-private. That's not including active and reserve military. And it's not including state and local employees. So we see the way all government has grown, but particularly, we see the way the federal government has grown. And it's grown by taking a role in areas that previously would have thought the federal government has no business being involved. Robert Naismith, historian, makes the observation that anybody who did not live before 1913 really does not understand what American freedom meant. Why do I use the year 1913? What happened in 1913? 16th Amendment and the income tax. Exactly. But when we look to the adoption of the income tax, this is what gave the fuel to feed Frankenstein and enabled him to grow as he did. But it also meant that government began being more and more involved in our lives. Prior to that time, as Naismith said, you could live almost your entire life without ever coming in contact with the federal government. April 15th came and went. It was just another day on the calendar. Because what government was supposed to do was to be done at the state and local level, not at the federal level. Jefferson, I think, summarized this very well when he said, in international affairs, we are one nation. In domestic affairs, we are 13 nations. Pretty good way to divide things. If it involves other countries, our relationship with the rest of the world, we need to stand together and work through the federal government. If it involves domestic matters, that should be addressed at the state or local level, and the federal government generally should not be involved. Well, that was a check on federal power, the 10th Amendment, but we have other checks as well. One of those checks is the military. You think, well, the military, that's federal, isn't it? Not the way it was originally conceived. As we saw in the last hour, Congress has the power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation may be for longer than a 2-year period. Their thought was that rather than relying upon a large standing army, and even in Washington's day, they wouldn't have said we could do with no standing army at all, but the bulwark of America's defense was to be through the state militias. And state militias, of course, were people who usually trained at the local level, elected their own officers at the local level, came already trained in the use of firearms, and when you showed up for militia duty, you get an invitation. The invitation had at the bottom, BYOG, bring your own gun. And anyway, so both Hamilton and Madison in the Federalist Papers talk about how firearms in the hands of the people through their local militias are not only a means of defense, they are also a protection against federal tyranny. In fact, Madison goes into this in great detail in the Federalist paper, where he explains in a country of a certain size, the federal government could probably muster an army no more than, and he suggests maybe 100,000 or so. And he said, compared to this would be state militias numbering well over 1 million, and no federal government could overcome a check like this. But of course, the provision was that those local militias, to be effective, would have to be armed. So there is one check. Now we look to what the Constitution has to say about military defense, and it talks about, as I say, Congress raising and support armies, but it also talks about these militias. And militia, normally we would think of that the way we would think of the National Guard today. That's not exactly the way it was at that time. The state militia could be federalized, could be called into federal service, but normally it'd be under the control of the state. And the Constitution provides further that Congress may prescribe discipline for the militias, but it goes on to say subject to control of the states, and goes on to say further, reserving to the states the power to appoint officers in their militias. Now there could come a really interesting issue. Let's suppose that President Biden issued an order that we are going to have transgender officers in the National Guard. Let's say the National Guard Bureau put that order out. And let's say Governor Abbott says, not in my Texas National Guard, you're not. We've got a real interesting constitutional issue. And we're seeing something of that conflict coming in with the conflict that has taken place in the last several months between Texas and the federal government over immigration. Governor Abbott has claimed, correctly in my opinion, that one of the responsibilities of the state, as well as a right of the state, is to protect its people from invasion. And he says, we here in Texas are being invaded. And so we started putting in barbed wire there. It was for the purpose of keeping immigrants out. And Biden claimed the authority to cut this wire. As far as I know, they never actually cut any, but they were threatening to. And the federal government had a limited victory in a federal court where the court said that, yes, you can cut the wire. You have the authority to cut the wire, but as Governor Abbott pointed out, they never said we couldn't put up wire. They just said that the feds could cut it. And if they do cut it, they never said we can't replace it. We'll replace wire just as long as they cut it. And he did. And then, of course, came the issue of calling up the Texas National Guard and the Florida National Guard. Some of their troops came to help. A few of ours from Alabama came as well. Those from Oklahoma, and I think several other states as well, came to stand with the Texas National Guard in support of the border there. And several Democrats in Congress then were saying, President Biden, you have the authority to federalize the National Guard. I think you should federalize the Texas National Guard right now. Well, Biden didn't do that. But I like the rather mysterious statement of Governor Abbott. Yes, they have the authority to federalize our Texas National Guard, and we have plans in place what to do if they try to do that. What his plans were, I'm not quite sure, but it might involve the State Guard. Here's something a lot of people aren't aware of in the federal-state relationship, and that's that besides the National Guard, we have in about half the states in the country forces that are either called the State Guard or the State Defense Force, or the California Volunteer Militia, or Connecticut. Several other states have different names for this force, but this is a force that is under the control of the state, but not under the control of the federal government. And anyway, the way this works, back in the Suez Crisis, back in the 1950s, when the president called up several National Guards from several states to go into action to protect our interests during the Suez Canal crisis with Egypt, several of the state governors protested, you can't take our guard. If you take our guard, who's going to take care of riot control here in our state? Who's going to man the borders? Who's going to man the bridges and take care of the armories and the other things that our National Guard does? As a result, in the 1950s, Congress passed the State Defense Force Act, by which they authorized each state to maintain they called it a defense force, but many states call it the State Guard. This would be a force that would be independent of federal control, and the act specifically says that the State Guard or State Defense Force may not be called up to federal service under any circumstances. Yes, President Biden could federalize the Texas National Guard. But if Governor Abbott then calls up the Texas State Guard, which frankly of all the state guards in the nation, the Texas State Guard is probably the best one. If he calls up the Texas State Guard, Biden is powerless to federalize the State Guard. It may be that he is thinking about utilizing the State Guard, and maybe he had some plan in place where many of the Texas National Guardsmen could immediately be transferred to the State Guard instead. I don't know if he had that idea in mind or not. But that is one power that the states do have, specifically recognized in federal law. And unfortunately, only about half the states have a State Guard, and it's something that really should be done in every state. The National Guard originally was what the State Guard is today, but after the war between the states, some of the State Guards tended to get a little disorganized and a little sloppy about things. And so around 1900, they passed the National Guard Improvement Act, and this provided federal funding to the National Guards of each of the states, and with that, federal regulation to the point where today, well, the National Guard does a very good job of aiding the federal armed forces in Desert Storm and other activities like this, and also do a very good job at protecting the state in the event of national disasters like flood and hurricane and things. As far as the role that the Guard was originally to have of protecting the state against federal tyranny, The National Guard really does not do anything in that regard because basically they are national rather than state now. That's why I think we need to take a greater look at the state guards. Anyway, they say the military is not only a power divided between the President and Congress, it is also divided between the federal government and the states. And the state needs to reassert its role there. A third check on federal power used to be the United States Senate. As I'd mentioned before, until 1913, you did not elect your United States senators. They would be appointed by your state legislature. I used to think when I was a kid that the eastern half of the state, one senator represented the eastern half, the other senator represented the western half, and that, of course, is not true. Each senator represented the entire state, but he represented the state government, the state legislature in particular, not necessarily the people of the state. The congressman was elected from a district by the people. He represented the people of his district. The senators represented the state, but particularly the state legislature, because the state legislature appointed them. In 1913, we ratified the 15th Amendment, the amendment which provides for direct election of United States senators. And the result of this is that today, the Senate no longer protects the state as a state entity. It is no longer the state legislature's check upon federal power. Rather, the Senate isn't that much different from the House, except that they represent a larger area and they serve 6-year terms instead of 2-year terms. But an important state check on federal power was eliminated when we went to direct election of United States senators. But now let's look at a few other areas, and we've seen some of the checks provided on the federal government. Let's look at the way some of those checks were eroded away. I'm going to talk about several constitutional amendments, the 14th Amendment in particular, but before I do that, I'll mention the 15th and the 16th. The 16th, by providing a source of federal income, the income tax, enabled the federal bureaucracy to grow because it gave us the fuel to feed Frankenstein. We've already mentioned the 15th, and I shouldn't have said the 15th. The 15th deals with the right to vote. When I talked about direct election of U.S. senators, I should have said the 17th, but adopted at the same time as the 16th, 1918. But a key amendment here is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868. It's an interesting observation that you look to the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments have the effect of limiting federal power. Nearly all of the remaining amendments have the effect of expanding federal power. But let's look at the 14th in particular. Several things the 14th provide that we think would certainly be good things. First of all, it provides that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Originally, we saw a similar provision in the Fifth Amendment, but the Fifth Amendment only applied to the federal government. The 14th, nor shall any state, clearly prohibits state and local governments from depriving people of due process of law as well. You look to that, and on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But gradually, there developed out of this a doctrine that we know in law as the incorporation doctrine. And the incorporation doctrine says that the Bill of Rights, or at least a large share of the Bill of Rights, are incorporated into the 14th Amendment, and they now apply to the states as well. Originally, the Bill of Rights applied only to the federal government. Barron versus Baltimore, a Supreme Court case in 1833, Justice Marshall, speaking for a unanimous Supreme Court at that time, said the Bill of Rights only binds the federal government for protection against abuses of their rights by the state governments. People need to look to their state courts and their state constitutions. However, when the 14th Amendment is adopted in 1868, it now says states must not abridge life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Originally, that was thought to simply mean that the state can't execute people, it can't enslave people or jail people, it can't fine people without giving them due process of law, that is, a fair trial. But gradually, in the later 1800s and early 1900s, this incorporation doctrine developed, and the doctrine simply says that various rights that we see in the Bill of Rights, like substantive rights, freedom of speech and the like, or procedural rights, like the right to a jury trial and these things, these are all incorporated into the Due Process Clause, and thereby they apply to the states. So now the Bill of Rights applies to the states and local governments, as well as the federal government. And at first that might seem like a good thing. But what we have done is we have federalized the whole business of rights protection. And effectively what this means is that state constitutions really mean very little in this regard, and state courts simply mimic what the federal courts say, and they follow the federal constitution rather than their state constitutions. This revolutionizes the whole business of rights protection by putting all of this into the federal courts, thereby a massive power shift to the federal courts. As to whether this is what the framers intended, clearly it's not what the framers of the Bill of Rights intended. I think it very doubtful it's what the framers of even the 14th Amendment intended. In fact, if they had clearly said in the 14th Amendment that states no longer have power over these things and that the Bill of Rights is now incorporated and applied to the states, it would never have been ratified. Wouldn't have been passed in Congress, let alone ratified. And to make that drastic a change, either it was subterfuge or else subsequent courts and subsequent academics are misinterpreting what the framers of the 14th Amendment intended. But be aware that the doctrine is there, the incorporation doctrine is there. That's why when you read in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. As you read that, the way it's applied today, you can cross out the word Congress and write in its place, government at all levels shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And maybe that's a good idea, maybe that isn't. But if that is to be done, it should be by a constitutional amendment, not by simply rewriting or reinterpreting the Constitution to mean something that the framers never intended it to mean. Anyway, the incorporation doctrine then is something that has greatly expanded federal power and, I think, doing violence to what the framers intended. There is a professor who Professor Fairman wrote an outstanding article in the Stanford Law Journal that I think thoroughly refuted the incorporation doctrine. It hasn't been answered since. Raoul Berger, who is a professor of law at Yale and not really a conservative, wrote an excellent book titled Government by Judiciary, The Transformation by the 14th Amendment. It's an outstanding book. As I say, he's not a conservative, and yet he sees through the fallacy of this incorporation doctrine very well and how it has really federalized the whole business of human rights. The 16th Amendment, we've already mentioned, as a way of fueling the bureaucracy. The 15th Amendment, or the 17th Amendment, I should say, as a means of eliminating the state check in the United States Senate. But let's look also at the way various court decisions have expanded, twisted, stretched various delegations of power to the federal government to give them far more power than the framers ever intended. We've talked about the General Welfare Clause before. Now, the General Welfare Clause is found twice in the Constitution. First, in the preamble, and the preamble doesn't give any powers, it just states purposes. But second, in Article 1, Section 8, the section that delegates powers to Congress. We saw there that Congress has the power to tax and spend for, among other things, the general welfare. Why didn't they just say welfare? Why did they say general welfare? Madison said every word of the Constitution decides a question of liberty and power. The meaning of the Constitution would be very different if it just said welfare, but by limiting that to general welfare, they meant that Congress does not have the power to tax and spend for the benefit of regions or occupations or individuals or socioeconomic groups. It has to benefit the welfare of the nation as a whole. But gradually this got changed, and one of the key cases was Stewart versus Stewart Machine, 1930s, dealing with the constitutionality of Social Security. Here's a tax, and this Social Security benefit goes to individuals, and so it was challenged that this benefited specific welfare, not general welfare. Building a highway or something like this would be general welfare, but subsidies to individuals, that's not general welfare, it was argued. Well, the Supreme Court took the case, and in a split decision, the Supreme Court said, you look what people receive Social Security all over the country, they're receiving it, and they're not just simply stuffing it away in a mattress. They are using it to buy gas and groceries and other such things. And as they do so, the economy as a whole is benefited. So we think we can say that, indirectly at least, Social Security benefits the general welfare. Okay, I can understand the reasoning. But if you accept that reasoning, I'd like to ask you to write to your congressman for me, because I have a bill that I am trying to get them to pass. It is called a bill establishing the John Eidsmoe Benevolent Fund. And I'm figuring maybe about $10 million will be sufficient to fund this. But I promise that I am going to use the $10 million in the John Eidsmoe Benevolent Fund to benefit the general welfare of the people of the United States. For one thing, I'll probably buy a condo up here in Idaho so that I can, and maybe about $1 million will be sufficient for that, and that way I can come up here regularly to speak for conferences like this and ski and hike and do other things. And look what that's going to do for the economy, the real estate, the building industry, and all sorts of things like this. But I probably won't want to spend all my time up here. Probably want to have another condo down at Gulf Shores in Alabama, and so that'll be another $1 million for that. And then I'll need a Learjet to go back and forth between them, and maybe a fleet of automobiles and other things like this. That's something I said. But all of this will be for the general welfare. But if that's the way you interpret general welfare, then you may as well just scratch the word general out of that phrase in the Constitution and say Congress may tax and spend for anything that promotes the welfare of anything or anybody. In other words, what they have done is they have amended the Constitution without actually going through the process of amendment. And in so doing, they have given the federal government far more power than the framers ever intended that it would have. Getting back to the Davy Crockett example or the James Madison example that I gave in the last hour. Similarly, they have twisted the Commerce Clause to give the federal government far more power than it was ever intended to have. As we saw before, there are 4 ends that we consider when we're looking at the Commerce Clause. You recall what those 4 ends were? You had one of them, I believe. Interstate, international, Indian, those 3 types of commerce Congress may regulate under the Commerce Clause. But there's a 4th type that they may not regulate. Somebody said domestic, but to be consistent with the ends, we'll say intrastate. Commerce between Boise and Twin Falls would be intrastate. Commerce between Boise and Helena would be interstate. And so they could regulate interstate, not regulate intrastate. And also they can regulate commerce, but they can't regulate manufacturing. Manufacturing comes before commerce. You produce a good, and then you put it into commerce. Commerce succeeds to manufacturing and is not part of it, the court said earlier. Gradually this got changed. We had a case, for example, Houston East and West Railway case involving the FCC's authority to regulate railroad rates, price of railroad tickets. And the way it had been done before is, let's say that you wanted to ship from, let's say, Shreveport, Louisiana, through, let's say, Dallas, on through Albuquerque, or on through Abilene, and then to Albuquerque, New Mexico. There we have both interstate and intrastate commerce. And if you bought a ticket from Shreveport to Dallas, you would pay the international rate or interstate rate. If you bought then a ticket from Dallas to Abilene, you'd pay the intrastate rate because that's all in Texas. And then if you went on to Albuquerque, you would pay the interstate rate again. This was quite confusing. And so the Supreme Court said that if, in order to effectuate a comprehensive scheme of regulation of interstate commerce, it is necessary to regulate the rates for intrastate commerce as well, Congress may regulate intrastate commerce. You can see the reasoning there, but you also see how that expands the power of the federal government. Then comes the key case in this area, 1937, National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. Jones and Laughlin Steel was a steel conglomerate. It had mines and smelting and all sorts of things in many different states. But anyway, there was a labor dispute that took place among the employees of Jones and Laughlin Steel, and the National Labor Relations Board claimed authority to come in and regulate and negotiate and settle this labor dispute. Jones and Laughlin Steel says, bug off, you have no authority here. They say, yes, we do, the National Labor Relations Act. Double bug off, they said, that is unconstitutional because that only applies to interstate commerce. This is not interstate commerce, it is intrastate, and it is production, not commerce. Bug off. And the Supreme Court looked at that, and by a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the power of the National Labor Relations Board to get involved in that dispute of local production. What they said was that unresolved labor disputes in the steel industry could lead to strikes. Strikes in the steel industry could lead to a shutdown of steel production. A shutdown of steel production could close off the free flow of steel in interstate commerce. Therefore, in order to preserve the free flow of steel in interstate commerce, if it is necessary to regulate local production, Congress can regulate local production. Come a few years later, 1942, a case of Wickard versus Filburn, which is probably the furthest the court ever went in this regard. Wickard versus Filburn involved a federal act that provided quotas, that is a certain limit to how much grain a farmer could raise on his acreage. And Farmer Filburn in Ohio raised an additional 23 acres of grain beyond what he was authorized to by the federal government. But instead of selling that extra grain in interstate commerce, he fed it as feed to his local livestock. And he is fined for exceeding his quota. And he says, how are you going to claim that the grain that I raised on my own farm and fed to my own pigs is interstate commerce? Pretty good question. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's easy. You see, if you hadn't raised that excess grain, then you would have had to buy grain at the elevator to feed your livestock, and that would have affected interstate commerce. And so by raising that excess grain, even though you fed it to your own livestock, you had a substantial effect on interstate commerce. And the test became, you could regulate, the federal government could regulate interstate commerce or interstate local production, so long as it has a substantial effect on interstate commerce. Now, since the court has become more conservative with Reagan appointees and Bush appointees, we haven't had any cases on this involving the Trump appointees yet, but they'd probably move further in this direction. The court has started to back off a little bit from this very excessive doctrine, but Still, effectively, you can rewrite the Commerce Clause to say Congress may regulate commerce and production of any kind, which again is not what the Constitution says. Then we take another clause I've mentioned in the last hour, that necessary and proper clause. The clause that we sometimes call the elastic clause, that simply says at the end of Article 1, Section 8, that Congress may do whatever is necessary and proper to carry into effect the foregoing powers or any other powers delegated to Congress under this Constitution. And as I said, this has to involve another power. They can't simply use the necessary and proper clause to regulate something that they can't find any other authority to regulate. For example, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, says that Congress has the authority to establish post offices and postal roads. Now, it doesn't say anything about printing stamps. It doesn't say anything about hiring mail carriers or mail trucks or anything like this, or buying pouches for mailmen to carry. But we would probably say that those things are necessary and proper to establishing post offices and postal roads, so the necessary and proper clause would authorize Congress to do these things in order that Congress may establish post offices and post roads, and with it, a postal system. However, the necessary and proper clause early was given a very, very broad interpretation, far beyond what I think the framers intended. And here's a key Supreme Court case, 1817 or thereabouts, and next to Marbury versus Madison, it is possibly the most famous Supreme Court case in history, and one of the first cases you study if you take constitutional law in law school. The case is called McCulloch versus Maryland. It seemed like they obsessed with the letter M, Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, and so on. But McCulloch versus Maryland dealt with the authority of Congress to establish a national bank. This has been a controversial issue ever since the days of the American War for Independence. There were some, like Alexander Hamilton, who believed that a national bank was necessary in order to effectuate commerce and put the United States on a good economic basis. There were others, like Jefferson, who believed a national bank would be too much federal power, and they opposed it. Anyway, Congress established a national bank, and then they let it expire, and we didn't have one for a number of years, and then they adopted one again. Well, when they adopted one again, then came the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, because one of the federal mints was located in the state of Maryland. Maryland was in the hands of anti-federalists or Jeffersonians, and they didn't like the idea of a national bank, so they said, we don't want a national bank, and we don't want it operating here in our state. We are filing a lawsuit to challenge its constitutionality. However, if you're going to say that a national bank is constitutional, we are going to impose a tax on the national bank, and it's going to have to pay us a tax of 2% on all its profits, just like we tax all other banks. So the case went to the United States Supreme Court. First of all, did Congress have the authority to establish a national bank? And secondly, if they do, may Maryland tax that national bank? Let's look at the first question, because clearly the Constitution has no provision that says Congress may establish a national bank. However, there are other provisions that may somewhat relate to a national bank. Provisions like borrowing money and paying debts, fixing the weights and measures, fixing the value of currency, things like this, dealing in international commerce. And in all of these things, the federal government argued, having a national bank would be very helpful. But Maryland answered, yes, but the clause here doesn't say Congress has the power to do whatever is helpful. It says Congress has the power to do whatever is necessary and proper. Maybe a bank is helpful, but it isn't necessary and proper. In other words, We could run an economy in this country without a national bank. We showed that by doing it for a number of years. You don't have to have a national bank. So even if it's helpful, it is not necessary. Well, as I said, John Marshall was very good at taking words, citing definitions to make you think you said exactly the opposite of what you said. There is a story about John Marshall that he was a temperate man mostly, but once in a while he did like to have a drink. And he had a policy that the justices on his court could drink only if it were a rainy day. Well, one afternoon he kind of wanted a drink. And he's looking out the window and he doesn't see any clouds anywhere. And so he asks, how far north does the jurisdiction of this court extend? Well, all the way to the Canadian border. How far south? Well, all the way down to the border of Georgia, and possibly when we get Florida, it'll be even down all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. How far east? Well, to the Atlantic seaboard and several miles beyond. How far west? Well, now with the Louisiana Purchase, all the way beyond the Mississippi. And Marshall said, somewhere in that vast expanse, it has to be raining. Let's have a drink. Well, how do you reason with somebody who thinks like that? Anyway, Marshall proceeds, in his opinion, to convince us that necessary doesn't mean absolutely necessary. That necessary just means helpful or efficient. And he does have a point. We do use the word that way sometimes. Let's suppose when I came here to speak, I had said to David, David, in order to give my lecture here, I'm going to have a podium up here. What do I mean by that? Do I mean there is no way I could possibly give this lecture without a podium? No, I'd fumble around with my papers and probably drop a lot of them, but I'd be able to get it done without this. In other words, when I use the term, I need a podium, or a podium is necessary, I don't mean it is absolutely indispensable. And Marshall says that's the way people commonly use the word necessary. And no, a national bank is not absolutely indispensable, but it is helpful. It is efficient for the purposes of getting money into circulation, paying debts, borrowing, and so on. And so it satisfies the requirements of the necessary and proper clause. Then as to the second part, as to whether the states could tax that national bank, Marshall's famous statement there is the power to tax is the power to destroy. And he said if the state could tax a national bank at 2%, they could tax it at 10%, or 50%, or 90%, or 100%. And so a state may not tax a federal entity. Well, I can only say in regard to Marshall's opinion there, you can understand his reasoning. But you can also see where if he'd reasoned it the other way, which also would have made sense, it would have limited the power of the federal government a great deal, and our whole history would have been very, very different. Let me talk about one more clause here that has been used to expand federal power, and that is Article 6, Section 2, the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause simply says that the Constitution and laws made under the authority thereof and treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and all state judges and justices shall be bound thereby, anything in state laws and state constitutions notwithstanding. That's the Supremacy Clause, and the way that is commonly applied is that any decision of a federal court is binding on all state courts, and anytime the federal does something, the states have to get in line and follow. Well, there's an excellent refutation of this, and it's on the table in back there. David has it on his table. It is in the writing there, the book by Liberty Fund titled Union and Liberty, and the subtitle is something to the effect of an anthology of the writings of John C. Calhoun. Included there is Calhoun's disquisition on government and his disquisition on the Constitution. I learned a lot from reading them, including the word disquisition. That means a systematic, organized discourse. But I'd especially recommend in that book his disquisition on government. And he is speaking there about the power of states to nullify federal actions. He is not speaking there about secession. Calhoun dies about 1850, and so secession becomes a major issue later. But he's speaking about the power of states to take a federal act that applies nationwide and say this act will be null and void as applied here in, let's say, South Carolina. And as he presents the arguments for this power of nullification, I'm reading this years and years ago, and you're making some good arguments here. You're pointing out that James Madison seemed to favor the power of state nullification, although Madison himself later denied that he had ever meant that, but you've quoted him to the extent that it seems like he did. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, clearly speaks about the power of nullification in his Kentucky Resolves and Virginia Resolves, that you see that Gouverneur Morris, strong Federalist, nevertheless, in the early 1800s, he was disillusioned with the United States, and he wanted the New England states and New York to secede and form a New England Confederacy. Daniel Webster, who was a strong advocate of the Union, nevertheless, at this time when the War of 1812 began, he urged the state governors to interpose and refuse to allow any troops to enlist from their respective states. So he says, clearly, there was a good argument for nullification, but I'm reading this and I'm thinking, yes, but the other side has a trump card, Senator Calhoun, and that is the Supremacy Clause, and you're not going to be able to get around that. And then Calhoun proceeds to address the Supremacy Clause and turn it into an argument for nullification. The Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. We'd all agree with that, right? But what portion of the Constitution is the supreme law of the land? All of it, okay? So if we're going to say that all of the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, does that include the amendments? An amendment, we read in Article 5 that when an amendment is ratified, it is for all intents and purposes part of the Constitution, so that has to include the amendments. If it includes the amendment, it has to include the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is part of the supreme law of the land. So what is the meaning of the Supremacy Clause? Anywhere in the Constitution where it delegates powers to the federal government, that is the supreme law of the land. Anywhere in the Constitution where it reserves powers to the states, that is equally the supreme law of the land. All the Supremacy Clause means is that the Constitution or the federal government is supreme in areas where the Constitution makes it supreme. In all other areas, it is not supreme, rather those powers are reserved to the states or to the people. And that, my friends, is the supreme law of the land. In other words, Calhoun has effectively made the Supremacy Clause into an argument for states' rights. I don't know how many times I've presented that in lectures and writings and so on. I've never had anybody even try to refute it. The point is very, very well taken. So, we see that the framers intended a system of government the way Jefferson described it. In international affairs, we are one nation. In domestic affairs, we are 13 nations, or today 50 nations. We've seen how the courts, with the enthusiastic cooperation of the legislative and executive branches, have twisted provisions of the Constitution to give the federal government far greater power than it had before. But what do we do about it now? Best solution I can give you is to strictly interpret the Constitution. First of all, we need to train people to understand the Constitution. I was amazed one time, this was 1987, I believe it was, or 86 probably. I was at a conference of constitutional law professors, about 30 of us, and one of the lecturers asked us, in teaching constitutional law to your law students, how many of you require your students to read the Constitution? About a third of us raised our hands. You could ace constitutional law and pass the bar exam without even reading the Constitution. In con law class, you'll have a lot about the Bill of Rights. You'll have a lot about the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, and the Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and a few others. But 90% of the Constitution you won't even touch in constitutional law class or on the bar exam. We need to be training people in the Constitution, so I can only suggest to you, read it. And I would suggest that just as war is too important to be left to the generals, so the Constitution is too important to be left to lawyers and judges alone. All of us need to take a role in becoming constitutional experts on our own. And then we need to choose judges and justices, whether you're in a state that elects judges or has them appointed or elects them on partisan or nonpartisan labels. Either way, you can have some input into what judges are selected. And take a role, especially at the local level of judges, because when you get to the Supreme Court, the pool of judges that they use to choose Supreme Court justices from come from the lower courts, so that's where the training ground is. Anyway, learn the Constitution, apply it, and seek to have the election or appointment of judges who share the strict construction of the Constitution. We have a couple minutes for questions before we need to take our break. So what questions do we have? No questions? Everybody just wants an extra 2-minute break. Okay, go ahead, sir. Question is asked here, of all of these decisions that expand the federal government, to what extent do I think they knew what they were doing? Well, let me begin with Justice Marshall and the McCulloch versus Maryland decision. I don't think Justice Marshall would have had any idea at all how far government would be expanded today. Even the most extreme Federalists at that time had no idea of that. But I'm sure they did know that they were opening the door for more. And as far as the New Deal decisions, the Jones and Laughlin Steel case and the Seward Machine case and so on, I suspect the liberal majority on the court, originally in the early 1930s, when Roosevelt was getting his New Deal legislation through Congress, a conservative court by a 5-4 margin was striking them down. But that majority changed, and I'm not going to go into all the detail there, but I think some of those justices really knew that they were doing far more than just giving some leeway to approve a few New Deal programs like Social Security. They knew they were laying the groundwork for a whole system of a welfare state, a government-controlled economy. I think some of them at least knew it. But to say to what extent they all knew it, you can't really categorize all of them the same way. And I have a hard enough time trying to figure out my own motives, let alone trying to judge others. One more? Go ahead. Okay, the question is, some of these progressive amendments, like the 16th, the income tax amendment, the 17th, the election of senators amendment, is there any possibility that with a more conservative court, these could be reversed? Well, the court, of course, cannot reverse amendments. The amendment would have to be repealed. We did repeal one amendment. That was the Prohibition Amendment that was adopted in somewhere like 1918 or thereabout, and then repealed several years later because it seemed to be unenforceable. I think what really happened was they adopted an amendment, they didn't enforce it, and then they declared it unenforceable. But anyway, but one of the effects of repealing prohibition, though, was that the issue of prohibition went back to the states rather than the federal government, which is probably where it should have been from the beginning. But anyway, so the amendment process, those amendments would have to be repealed, and you repeal an amendment only by passing a new amendment, which requires a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress subsequent to being ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, there is another means of amending the Constitution, and that's by a new constitutional convention. I don't really want to get into that issue in length here, except to say that I see that as a dangerous thing. First of all, because there is no way that I can see of limiting a constitutional convention to a single issue. And secondly, because those who are pushing for a constitutional convention seem to have a blind faith that those who would run a convention would be conservative constitutionalists. I see no guarantee of that at all. I think more likely it'll be run by Biden and Obama type liberals and could result in some very dangerous things. And what good would it do? So the Constitution, as it stands right now, gives all the protection we need. It's just that we're not properly enforcing it. So if we amend the Constitution, then we will enforce it? It makes no sense at all to me, but then that's not an issue that I really intend to get into in detail here, because honestly, that is an issue on which conservative Christians are divided. But anyway, that's my opinion. Well, it's time to take a... Sure, okay, go ahead. Okay, I talked about that in the previous hour, but the answer to the question I'd give to that would be what the Supreme Court itself said in Reed versus Covert back in the 1950s, when you had a case of whether or not a military dependent could be tried by a military court-martial if he or she committed a crime overseas, rather than being tried in the local court overseas. And if you say that she can be tried by court-martial, then that violates her constitutional right to a trial under Article 3 of the Constitution. Anyway, so the Supreme Court simply said in that case, Reed versus Covert, that a treaty may not supersede the Constitution, because if it did so, that would amount to amending the Constitution by a means that the Constitution does not contemplate. We can't get a constitutional amendment through, so we'll just enter into a treaty with some country and we'll amend it like that. That's not the way the framers contemplated amending the Constitution. So the Supreme Court said in Reed versus Covert that treaties may not supersede the Constitution. However, there are international law professors who believe that it does. So we talked about that more last time, but that's my answer again. Okay, we'll take a break.
Okay, so we're going to be on a break. It's going to be a short break, about 15 minutes. We'll come back for our last general session with John Eidsmoe. I just wanted to mention that in the next break, I'd like for you to make your final book purchases if possible, so that after Eric Hovind speaks from 4 to 5, I'll be able to break down my books fairly soon after that and put them away. So this is just like a 15-minute stretch refresh break, and then we'll get going again about 2:35.